Helen comes from Northern Ireland. She's a writer, critical thinker, and a movie director. Author of Guide to Making Love. So she's obviously expert on the fine line between authenticity and, alienation. And she's going to talk about psychocinema.
That's right, yeah.
How film mobilizes desire through alienation, right?
That's the title I chose to sort of fit into the alienation theme, I guess. Yeah.
So we'll leave Helen approximately half an hour, and then we have half an hour for discussion. So Helen, please.
Great, thanks so much. I was saying to Alfie before that I'm quite nervous because I absolutely have fetishized Slovenia as this magical philosophy utopia, and unfortunately, I haven't been let down. The good analysts of Ljubljana haven't sort of shown me that they're divided subjects, and that actually, at the end of Wizard of Oz, I draw the curtain back and there's nothing there, because it actually is so much better than I even thought. So damn, I'm even more nervous. So this talk is sort of about how I kind of interpret film as operating like psychoanalysis. So we have psychoanalytic film theory, that's a sort of a well-known dimension of thinking, and it's inspired by psychoanalysis. It possibly looks at what's going on inside the director's head, that kind of thing. But I actually think that film operates on the viewer like psychoanalysis on the analysand, and that this has sort of political implications. So I'll start. So the thesis is basically that cinema is an art form that has a potentially unique and emancipatory ability to confront the viewer with the lack that is the subject, evidenced in their desire. In this way, the effect of film on the viewer is that of psychoanalysis on the analysand. So this conference is entitled Alienations, and I wanted to think about this question of alienation. What is alienation? Possibly there is a primary alienation that's universal, that's something that psychoanalysis looks at, and then maybe that we're alienated from our alienation and we need to get back to this original alienation and sort of foreground it and not turn away from it. And that film is really good at getting us to confront the alienation of desire, the way that we are all universally alienated in our desire. So as we probably all know, I won't say the basics, but the primary alienation I'm referring to is the way that the human subject is born into the material world and then born into language in a second birth at a moment that they're separated from their primary caregiver. And this leaves the subject with a sense of lack, that they, on a pre-self-conscious level, experienced an imagined oneness with their primary caregiver, and they were separated at this moment where they graduated from being this sort of internal, external fetus, this pre-individual subject. They separated from their primary caregiver, and this separation leads to a distance, and then the frustration of an impossibility of communication leads to language, and this generates subjectivity. So this entrance into self-consciousness is necessitated that there was this separation and this lack. And the being imagines that there is this oneness that they could get back to. I mean, obviously this is basic Freud or whatever, that there could be this utopian oneness that they experienced where they had all their needs met before they came into self-consciousness. But this is an imagined, it's a sort of a fallacy. Eden only becomes the Garden of Eden insofar as it's lost. The breast only becomes this magical thing insofar as it's been lost. So the subject, in order to enter into, to be the privileged, self-conscious, human-speaking subject, must be alienated in a way. And this is something that affects all of us. We are united in this primary alienation. Obviously, later on, people have referred to this in sort of language of trauma and this kind of thing. And what comes later is something different. But this primary alienation, this marking by lack, is something that's universal, that affects all of us. So it's interesting then that psychoanalysis has been tied to film theory, and it's become sort of a major dynamic in film theory. There's words borrowed from Lacan and things like that. But I think that the film theory that is maybe the canonical film theory misses the dynamic in film, where film really operates like the analyst, on the analysand to confront them with the nature of their subjectivity in their lacking desire. And as I said, that psychoanalytic film theory is more focused on looking at the contents or the imagery of the film. Does the snake mean a penis? Was the what's going on in this male director's head? That kind of thing. And also possibly, we've seen terms that really in Lacan refer to the universal of lack, being turned into identitarian concepts, gendered concepts that miss this really political, universal, emancipatory nature of alienation that goes beyond gender. So I'm going to talk later on about gaze, specifically because this is something that is like a real thing in film theory, but I think misses the real emancipatory power of what's going on. And then this idea of being alienated from our alienation. So obviously Ray talked a lot about ideology earlier, and how ideology, in a sense, alienates us from our alienation, in that it uses a binary logic that tells us that there is a possibility for us to assuage our lack. Obviously, this is the ideology of capitalism, that there is a commodity or a place, the utopia of Slovenian philosophy, where I will be fully, met with other thinking people, and I'll be finally happy or whatever. This is the commodity logic of capitalism, and I slipped there because obviously fascism as well. But actually, that really we can never transcend our lack. Obviously, death drive is this impulse to try to seek out oneness in oblivion. So we have things like self-sabotage, where we get to sustain the image of fantasy that exists if only we didn't turn away from our imagined fulfillment at the last minute. And then talking about fascism, obviously the logic of fascism operates on this sort of enemy making the scapegoat mechanism, where there is this imagined perfect state of purity, totalitarian. It's never total enough because it can't incorporate lack, but it operates on the logic of an individual or a group being the contingent enemy behind whom the perfect world is cast in a shadow. But really the emancipatory or political insight of psychoanalysis is that there is no perfect world. We are all unified in our lack, and we should act accordingly. And this is obviously what Marx is getting at in the introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, with the plucking the living flower, and Freud's ordinary unhappiness as well. So I kind of wanted to talk about some of the key, what I would say are misunderstandings that have taken place in Lacanian film theory, and how possibly, as I said, the main insight that maybe we can take from film and psychoanalysis is that it operates as psychoanalysis, and that's the more powerful and potentially more interesting dynamic of film, rather than using psychoanalysis to sort of interpret the film. So what I have a bit of a funny anecdote about a very short-lived boyfriend that I had, and on our first date, he kind of went off on a rant about Freud, and I was like, ooh, maybe this is a sign that we shouldn't have been together, because his sort of interpretation was just how terrible and patriarchal and patronizing psychoanalysis was, because it's all about going to a man, an older man who you're lying powerless in front of, and he's just telling you what to think and telling you how to desire. And obviously, the opposite is true, right? So psychoanalysis is about the transferential relationship the analysand has with the analyst, where you imagine that the analyst has all this knowledge to tell you, but actually you're gradually let down, and you gradually realize, like, oh shit, he knows nothing, like myself, he's a divided other, but also that in order for him to see me and to have some kind of, for me to be recognized in the eyes of the analyst, he must be a divided subject who is capable of subjectivity, capable of speech, capable of discernment, in order to feed back to me who I am. And so this is possibly the linchpin of where I think psychoanalysis and film theory kind of went wrong. And it's probably not surprising that this term, the male gaze, became so foundational in film theory, potentially in the neoliberal university, where this ideological reading of film is more useful to sort of the reproduction of the department in which it's being taught. So we have this term, the male gaze and the female gaze, which has come to sort of dominate film theory. And we can even see very much how these ideas have impacted the way that film is reproduced, the way it is produced, the way it is funded, and the way that it's sort of imagined that there is an essentially transcendentally privileged position that one gender has over the other. Of course, this isn't to say that, contingent material history has affected maybe female subjectivity or the experience of being a woman, and that historically there were more male directors than female directors, but perhaps the reason why that has been the case is because we haven't yet got to a point in the market system of understanding the lack of promise in fulfillment, and that this is sort of a very anti-capitalist idea, and that this, in order to understand it, we must understand that everybody is a divided subject. So the male gaze, and this is something that comes up in a very famous 1973 essay by Laura Mulvey, who I'm sure many people know. And I wanted to sort of point out how gendering this term really is turning away from the radical potential of the idea. So of course we know that gaze is to do with, it's of interest to Lacan because it's pointing out how vision ideologically is often seen as a privileged form of sensing, a sort of totalitarian. We assume that we have 20/20 vision, or in hindsight, I realize that sight has this ideological dynamic to it that we imagine it is whole and complete, and we can trust I saw it with my very eyes. If we see other tastes, something like, taste being one of the five senses. And in that word, we understand that taste means discernment. And it refers back to the fact that in order to be a discerning subject, one must be a divided subject. One must have gone through the initial separation of alienation to become a speaking subject who thinks, who is self-conscious, and who is capable of taste, discernment. So, you might have a taste for chocolate biscuits or pizza or asparagus or something, but sight really is something that ideologically, we don't have that kind of automatic understanding of division. And so gaze really is to do with the understanding the divided nature of sight and the way in which we experience our division in the divided eyes of the other. So it's to do with the way that we are formed as subjects and are recognized, because in order to be recognized, we must be seen in the eyes of a subject who is already themselves divided. So to understand gaze as a male gaze, especially in the context of this essay, which is talking about, the contingent history of the production of film, which might be dominated by men, but it's sort of saying that gaze is about power and dominion. So male gaze is about how a man maybe sexualizes or objectifies a woman with their gaze. But it's sort of, whilst that may be true, it's the wrong term to use because actually it's about lack, and it's about the universal of lack. And we all have this gaze, whether we are male or female. And it's interesting that, what has sort of subsequently happened, and you have this as a sort of like common parlance in the culture. You might have a sort of Vice essay about female directors who are the emblem of the female gaze or something, as if we all know what the female gaze is, because females gaze in this way, or they look in this way, and men look in this way. And as I say, whilst, there may be these gender differences, they come at a moment that's later than this idea of gaze. And so gaze is sort of the wrong term. But also, we were talking about the beautiful soul right earlier. I mean, in this instance, which one's the beautiful soul? Is it the male gaze or the female gaze? In some ways, it's both, right? It's like the female gaze is this, perfect, understanding, rational, not objectifying. What do they call it? Maybe they're going to hire a sexuality, intimacy coordinator, something like that. And this is the subject who isn't a subject, right? They have all the right ideas in today's sort of purity culture of capitalism. The neoliberal logic to explicate, to hide really what's going on at the level of exploitation and things like that. We can pat ourselves on the back as sort of privileged filmmakers that we have the right ideas because we're female. But again, this misses, and we were talking about the beautiful soul, and what the tragedy of the beautiful soul is. The beautiful soul, almost as this paranoid schizoid, casts out any contradiction and is themselves sublime, transcendent possibly, but this means that they are not the divided subject in the melee of the universe, and the sort of in the Joycean term, the chaosmos. They aren't existing at the level of the human subject. And in the same way, the male gaze, is a beautiful soul in a different way, where they have absolute power over their crew, and they, So, and as I say, whilst maybe there are some men who direct like that in some ways, or in some cultural ways, at a foundational subjectivity level, gaze is sort of the wrong word to use here. And I'm thinking about the master-slave dialectic in the phenomenology, obviously, that here what Hegel's kind of describing is how the slave in the sort of Greco-Roman civilization is cast as a subject who doesn't have subjectivity, who is undivided. And this is a disaster because, of course, they are human subjects and they can think and reason like the citizen. And that this is a disaster for the civilization itself. It's casting out the contradiction by claiming that there is a purity, almost a sort of the way that we elevate and debase the other in an Orientalist sense in terms of capitalism and colonialism, but that the other is a human subject and they have the capacity to feed back to the civilization what is really going on, from the gaze of the other in terms of recognition, to feed back to the civilization what's going on so it can meet reality better and sort of move with reality better. And this is missed, and sort of this leads to the civilizational collapse. So, I guess also another sort of trend, but this is a sort of more minor one, but I'll come on to the flip side of it in a second, is how a lot of film theory became about destroying meta-narratives and grand narratives, and the sort of arrogant idea that you can copy reality and create a reality on a film set. But I kind of want to argue that this sort of misses the point here, because actually we do need the kind of transferential relationship with the viewer to be brought along and guided by desire through a riven story, through the whole architecture and artifice of film, to sort of lead them to believe that they are going to be confronted with fulfillment at this point of revelation, but that maybe this is the point where, like a good analyst, we can rip the temple curtain and show that God is divided. And obviously lots of theorists in theology have talked about how only Christians can be an atheist. I mean, this is a big thing with Slavoj, obviously, and Simone Weil, and so many people have said it. But, this is obviously the logic of the practice of psychoanalysis, that we need to sort of go there to believe in order to be disabused. So psychoanalysis, it's all about the universal of what we all lack, that we're united by difference. And obviously this is what is political in psychoanalysis, because as Marx points out with his image of picking the living flower, if we can understand that we live in a divided universe, and not only that subjectivity is sort of, as Alenka says, the ticks and grimaces of the universe lack at the level of subjectivity experiencing itself, then possibly we can build societies that exist more in connection with reality, and that capitalism and ideology in general tries to understand that this lack is contingent, that there is a possible utopia out there and that there's just something in the way. But obviously the thing that's in the way gets us to believe that there is this utopia. So psychoanalysis is about understanding this primary alienation, and symptoms studied by psychoanalysis often speak to the way that we repress contradiction, and we repress this essential alienation, and then these symptoms return. I also kind of wanted to talk about, so in that sense, psychoanalysis has this universal dynamic in that it's about the way that every human subject is divided. The subject who is divided, I won't get into sort of the nitty-gritty of how desires function, because blah-de-blah, but so human subjects, because they're divided, they also desire. And so desire is this element of subjectivity that points to the way that the subject lacks, because there's always this desire to overcome lack in fulfillment. Desire, furthermore, is collective in the way that it is structured. So if we look back to the way that the human becomes the subject through primary alienation, their desire operates on the desire of their parents, who themselves are parented by others, who themselves are part of a wider collective. So politically speaking, desire is collective. It's not something that we have as an essence that we are born with, but it's something that imprints us as we enter into language. So there were these sort of universal aspects of psychoanalysis. Likewise, film, kind of in a more obvious way, is a universal medium if we're thinking about, artistic mediums. So it's, or at least collective. So if we look at the level of production, big teams make films. We view films often in a collective way, in a dark room together. The way that broadcast media works, you have a single entity that is sort of reproduced and reproduced. So lots of people are watching films at the same time. So on a basic kind of level, we can see that film has this sort of universal aspiration, maybe similarly to psychoanalysis. Film also has lots of sort of visceral bodily implications that operate, even though I've just talked about how language is the universal that identifies the human subject, but across language. So obviously languages are different depending on where we're from. But on a bodily level, film has this sort of visceral implications, and we can see this in the colours, the production design, the sound, the music. Music isn't just music, it's very much music that's designed to elicit affect in a certain way at certain points so that we pay attention here or don't pay attention there. And this is something that I read an article on years ago, so I don't know if it's absolute bollocks or not, but when we watch a film, so it's sort of, in this article it said, that when we respond to the emotions of others, we are actually responding on sort of tiny muscle levels on our faces. So Gregor's sort of frowning there, trying to understand, and maybe at a tiny level, the micro muscles in my face are also doing the same thing. So this is happening at maybe a pre-language level. And I think about the example of the Real Housewives, right, where they're always getting into like huge arguments. Maybe it's because they're also Botoxed, that their face muscles are so frozen that they can't understand each other. They can't get the basics of sort of what each other is sort of saying. So on that very basic level, film is obviously visceral and has these sort of collective implications in the way it's produced and the way it's viewed. But also, I think in more of a universal level, it works psychoanalytically upon the subject. And I think there's sort of two separate ways that we can say that film is like psychoanalysis. So first of all, I think about orgasm, right? So sex is obviously something that's of interest to psychoanalysis, not because sex is sort of the thing, but really maybe sex is the not thing, the thing that gets us to confront or exposes us to the lack in our desire, to the way that we were alienated in subjectivity. So obviously the French little death after orgasm, we are led to this orgasmic moment, we have all this foreplay, we're so into it, whatever, we have orgasm, and then it sort of ends. And I know that Todd McGowan's talked a lot about things like the way that we aspire to have, the fastest car, whatever, as soon as we buy it, bam, we drive away when we have buyer's remorse. So sex is of interest to psychoanalysis in this sense because it points to the death of desire, the lack in desire, that there is no promise in fulfillment. We have orgasm and what, But film on a basic level, it can also do this. And if we sort of see the sort of very riven, even Hollywood form of film that leads the view, you have a lacking subject who's the main character, and they go after a goal, and we are sort of led through music, sound, we're titillated, we're, like the foreplay and orgasm, the viewer is like, oh my God, is it, will it, won't it, will it, won't it? And even on sort of a basic level, if the character is fulfilled, potentially like the subject who experiences orgasm, so what? We leave the theatre and there's nothing there. But I actually think that in a deeper kind of way, and we saw this actually a lot. There's lots of films from sort of 100 years ago that I think are kind of really good examples of this, although there was a film in 2021, Pig, that I think worked in this way that was really quite fascinating and psychoanalytic, is that it has the capacity to operate like, as I was saying, only the Christian can be the atheist. You tear the temple curtain, there's nothing there. There is no fulfillment in desire. So a famous example is obviously Wizard of Oz that I referred to, that the characters, the viewers engage with the characters and they're led on this sort of quest to seek the wizard and to get all this knowledge. And when they arrive, it's just a man with a microphone. And it's not just that the story, it's about being let down and that there's no big other or anything like that. Film itself is able to engage and libidinally move the subject, bring them in by desire, draw them in, to really lull them into this belief that they're going to be fulfilled, and then potentially a psychoanalytic film might expose the Lacan desire at that precise point of revelation. And the thing that film's so capable of is to prime us to believe. And this is obviously how psychoanalysis in some ways operates, where, as I referred to with this silly ex-boyfriend, that they imagine that there is this all-knowing other who is going to fulfill them. And it's only in that belief that they can be let down and confront the lack in their desire. I think that's basically it.
Thank you, Helen. Questions? There you go.
Thank you, Helen. This was very interesting. I was very happy to hear, someone passionately defend universalism in a time where it does not seem to be the obvious way to go. I was wondering, maybe I don't understand your comparison between film and literature well enough.
Okay.
Just for instance, what would be the analyst and what would be the analysant? Is there, if film is psychoanalysis, then who or what is...
the film itself.
Is both?
The film itself is the analyst and the viewer is the analysand.
All right. Okay, this was just a clarification question.
Okay, thanks. This might be a very bad question, but I'm trying it out anyway. The reason is, it has to do. You mentioned that there's this that we should get rid of the grand narratives and so on, and I gather that you had something maybe of a critique towards that. But in this, I'm somehow reminded here. I think. I'm a big fan of James Baldwin, and he has a really great way of analyzing the difference between a plot and a story. And these are, of course, in certain ways arbitrary concepts, but his point is that, and this is particularly in relation to Hollywood, that Hollywood operates, and maybe ideology operates with the function of a plot. So you basically know where you're going to go. You have a certain, and then you create the narrative like that. It seems to me that the way in which you characterize now psychoanalytic, that the film in its, what would it mean for the film in itself to be psychoanalytic? Now, in a certain way, it seems to be that if you say that, well, that will mean, for instance, that we, Wizard of Oz, in the end, there is no subject, for instance. That seems to mean, that sense, to be a plot, exactly. And I think wouldn't really be good psychoanalysis, to the extent I understand it. Because it somehow, then that seems to imply that the analyst really is the one that knows. So in the end, the analyst will show you that, there wasn't, you're a divided subject, blah, 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 which means that that the analyst really knows. No, so I find somehow I'm not saying that it has to be like it, but the potential at least is that you get a plot in that sense in psychoanalysis, in the discourse of psychoanalysis and film also. And I'm just, I'm not going to discuss what Baldwin thinks about stories, but I think that might be a better key. So it's just...
it's interesting because, I would say that there's obviously a theory and practice of psychoanalysis. There is some knowledge there. It's not like... Because if you're saying that there is no... that there is some knowledge, but the knowledge is that there is no thing. So it's, Slav always talks about the negation of the negation, right? That if this is a positive or something that you can reify the negation. But there is something there. Otherwise, there is a practice of psychoanalysis, right? So...
There's a difference between theory and practice. Sorry, just to clarify, because what you said somehow helped me. There might be, of course, as a theorist or a philosopher, you might say, we have this, but as a practice of an analysis, that seems not to really. Or this is a question. whether or not that's whether or not the analyst can be the theoretician here, and whether or not the film can be like just a exhibition of a theory, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, but this is the thing. I think that there's two different things, and I think sometimes about the films that I make that there's. I've made films that are like a documentary about psychoanalysis, right, which is a presentation of the theory, or an attempt. I mean, not a successful attempt by any means, but just like a way to play with it, where you're kind of looking at the level of the concept playing out on the subject as a viewer, and having a go at seeing if this operates in the subject in a certain way.
Okay, I'm terribly sorry. Well, I had a similar question, although perhaps significantly more naive. Beginning with this notion of the position of the viewer as compared to the position of the psychoanalytic subject, going into psychoanalysis, obviously, we have this expectation, right, of the analyst, whereas going into a film, as you've mentioned, we kind of have predetermined kind of expectations of an entertainment. So I suppose I'm kind of coming at it from a different angle. I'm wondering whether, not whether film necessarily can be psychoanalytic in the sense that you described, but whether the viewer can be an analysand in that sense, if that makes sense. Whether it can be an effective form of psychotherapy. I
don't know. I don't know if it's as I say, and maybe this is answering your question in terms of the determinant. There's no, I think this is the difference maybe between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. It's like there's no determination of like this should have a, that there's a need for this or whatever. This is just an exposure of lack and desire, which one could, say is a universal that we need to be reminded of in a world where we operate on sort of binary utopian logic to sort of nullify the lack that underpins subjectivity. So there's no, I'm going to go and, I guess it's the difference between like consciousness raising and unconsciousness raising, right? So this would be something that maybe that there's something in film that's capable of doing unconsciousness raising, so bringing to the surface the unconscious in the viewership, rather than, a predetermined message or whatever.
Yes, no, absolutely. Yeah. And the suggestion I actually wanted to make was, if we're talking about the analyst as being shown himself to the analysand is kind of lacking in some way. An interesting, I think, instance of that, rather perhaps than Wizard of Oz, although I certainly see your point, is perhaps Tarkovsky's Stalker. Because ultimately, in the end, right, the film fails itself to convey. Yeah. And in many ways, it can be viewed as a series of failures to directly convey, not because of an intentional impressionistic style, but because of a sort of, you could almost call it a meta-narrative failure of film as a medium to convey.
Yeah, and it's true. I think there's always going to be a failure in an attempt to create a meta-narrative. So that's partly why meta-narratives are so interesting, because they expose ideology so readily. I think this is partly like, I think film is often fodder for people who are interested in psychoanalysis to discuss psychoanalytic concepts, because sometimes like the worst sort of Hollywood commercial films are the most productive to talk about, for instance, ideology, because they precisely fail and the contradiction is so obvious, and they can be quite funny to discuss, definitely, yeah.
Sorry, there are two questions more, but I would jump in.
Oh, yeah, go for it, yeah.
I have some questions concerning, I think the problem is somehow that the movie viewer has somehow a choice. As well as someone who goes to analysis, there are preliminary, talks, and after that you are somehow mature to do psychoanalysis. And film viewers are the same, So there are some who enjoy alienation.
Yeah.
I would ask you, what about horror genre?
What about
horror?
Horror genre. I mean,
horror. Just a second.
Yeah.
Because you were talking about alienation, being alienated, etc. And this is the genre where people enjoy being alienated.
No, I know.
I mean, there's strange, there's horror, there's eerie, there's weird, etc. So, And also, you were talking about orgasm and jerk, etc. So, Linda Williams, which is a very famous interpreter of porn films, coined the term jerk effect.
Okay.
And this is also something that she tries to classify horror movies, because they are also somehow engaging body. So there's a visceral, etc. What were we talking about? And furthermore, I really liked your universal perspective on the gaze. And if in horror movies you always have a very neutral, to put it, gaze, because it looks, it gazes, they leave, etc.
Yeah,
so
no,
it's
exactly,
not sex.
exactly.
So.
No, I do. It's interesting you raise this, because I personally, just on a taste level, I don't enjoy. I'm totally scared of everything, so I can't do horror. Like I once went to this theme park where they had like a horror house, and it actually has like actors in it. And even if you know they're actors, I actually felt like I was crying. It was horrendous. Like I can't. So I partly don't. But I also don't think that maybe horror operates in the same way. It's doing something else than maybe other kinds of film. I mean, all sorts of genres operate in different ways, and to talk about plot, have certain devices that operate on the viewer in a given way. And I know that, like Slavoj, I'm not an expert. I know Slavoj has written about porn as opposed to film, and I do think there's maybe a connection there. And I think it's different to precisely because of that element of gaze. Yeah. Because it's the idea that there is some, but it's to do with affect and primal fears and all this kind of stuff. But yeah.
Helen, thank you for a very interesting talk. I have two questions. First, I really would like you to clarify again what you think has gone wrong with the Laura Mulvey model.
Yeah.
We can call that the Anglicization of Lacanian, the Lacanian gaze, right?
Yeah.
So I love to hear you talk more about that, because it has been such an influential model, right?
Yeah.
So number one. Number two is your analogy of film and audience as analyst and analyst song. So one question I have is in a psychoanalytic session, is the analyst song who talks, right?
That's true. That is
but
true.
In film,
it's
the film that is talking to us. So how do you?
No, it's interesting because I was thinking about like the Barthes idea of the readly text and the writely text, right? Because obviously the critique there is that the writely text, which gets the viewer to, the reader to engage more in the text, is the superior text in a way. And in a way, there's this idea that film is more readerly than writerly. But I think, in a sense, the readerliness operates on a level of the unconscious that can maybe draw the viewer in a writerly way. But that is an interesting thought. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. I just like you to say that. But tell us more about the
Laura Mulvey.
Anglicization.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do think this is, the way you say Anglicization, because it absolutely is this transfer of the French into English, and it's sort of domestication. Yeah. So it's, and it is very much. This particular essay is very interesting because it's not a Lacan that I would recognize, but I'm sure we all have our own interpretations of Lacan. In that, Lacan is about looking at this primary alienation that operates in all subjects, and it seems to me that in this essay, and I don't think it's a surprise that it's taken off, because it's more fits into what people already think, right? So it's recognizing, possibly quite rightly, the history of film in relation to women, but maybe a certain type of women or whatever, and it sort of explicates maybe what the writer is already seeing, and sort of has read into Lacan something that explicates a certain interpretation, which I would say is a kind of binary oppositional rationalization of the history of capitalism and film, rather than understanding that that's not going far enough. That actually that is a logic that's also operating in the capitalist binary oppositional logic that then can be weaponized by the market. And we can see that this is absolutely infiltrated, the Sundance Film Festival, and I don't know, the Goldman Sachs boardroom, that, we need female CEOs or whatever, that this is going to transform capitalism. But again, and there's many different ways in which this operates. I think Alfie was saying yesterday about the progress narrative, capitalism so obviously is failing and there has been no progress for people in terms of living standards, but, we get to imagine that we have this, superior idea that we're better than our peers in the past because we have more enlightened views, But again, it operates in this binary logic of essentialism and difference that is also the logic, I think, of the market system. So I think it doesn't go far enough. And whilst, there's some good points in that essay and, no. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Helen. Brilliant. I have 2 questions. And the first one is, I think, maybe a little bit complex, so I'll try to explain myself. I think your argument about and the critique of this idea of the genderized gaze and so on is great, and I totally agree that film as such has this function of keeping us within the leg, maintaining, trying not to, to uncover this phantasmal shield of totality or satisfaction of desire or whatever. But I was wondering, because there are 2 fundamental relations of the subject. One is the relation to the other. Desire is the desire of the other. We all divided subjects and so on. The other is relation to the big other, to the ego ideal. So Lacan has 2 examples of for one and for the other. So the first one is this image of example of the phantom bucket. Phantom bucket. Okay, which it is this old school illusion. From the 16th century, optical illusion that if you put a vase and the bucket below the vase, and then you have a concave mirror, and then you have another normal mirror. So if you watch it in the normal mirror, you see the bucket in the vase, but actually it is not. Real, it is not in the vase. Yeah. So what Lacan wanted to point out here is that imaginary, so how we see the world, is always structured by the symbolic. So by our desire. No? So how we want to see, it's not the real picture of the world. It's always like a parallax view. It's always shifted perspective. But this all speaks about this first level of the subject's relation to the other. But then there is another optical example of Lacan, which speaks about the subject's relation to the big other. This is his turn of the classical idea of how we see the world. Classical idea is that the gaze is in our eyes, and that we see the world as a representation of how the world is. Like Kant's idea, for example. But Lacan's shift is that the gaze is not in my eye, but it's all around. Yeah. So I'm the picture. I'm the one being watched by the gaze. Yeah. So this is my relation to the big other, no? Yeah. To the ego ideal. Yeah. Now, my question. The question is, how... of course, on the level of the relationship to the other, I think for sure we cannot speak about gendered gaze and so on and so on. But do you think that on the level of this big other, which ego ideal, so do you think that here we can still speak exactly about the masculine gaze, the feminine gaze? Do you understand the question? It's this big other is the level of the ideology.
Yeah.
It's the level, for example.
But do you feel in a way though that ideology operates maybe on a different level? You know, so and in a way this. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No. Just go for it.
Yeah. So that I always sort of think about like ideology being that kind of like warm, fuzzy feeling that you know to be true, right? That makes you sort of feel satisfied. But then you can kind of get to this level of rationalization or symbolization of digestion of, you know, bringing the real into the symbolic or something that is different. But it does operate on you nonetheless.
Yeah, I think too complex question. Later,
yeah, let's chat later. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but you have to speed up a little because we have just a couple of minutes and there's four more.
I have a
questions.
very simple
I
question.
Like to cut anybody, so.
I have a simple and short question. You know, you've mentioned part and so, but there are of course efforts in the theory of literature to not to deal with the interpretation of symbols and to try to parallel. In Brooks' reading for the plot.
Yeah.
You know, he tries that. But he just is satisfied with transference. And there's not a concept you are dealing with anyway.
Transference?
Yes.
No, I think it is interesting in relation to film, yeah.
For Brooks, it's the very point of the impact of literature.
No, exactly.
It's not film, but it's transference.
No, it's similar.
Transference, that's what he does.
Yeah, I agree with that, yeah. Yeah.
That was efficient. What you told us made me think of Jean-Luc Godard's famous maxime. Le monde substitue à notre regard, le cinéma substitue à notre regard un monde qui s'accorde avec notre désir. So the cinema substitute to our gaze a world that fits or that I don't know how to translate that down. That is in synchronization with our desire, which is a quote which is of course abysmal because it's not about satisfaction. It's not about giving you something that you want, but precisely displacing what you see at the level of desire that you didn't know you had, or something like that. And my question here is then, if it fits somehow within what you have said, couldn't we say that there are cases where actually the lack that you see active in film is actually sutured. It's actually presented in something that it's more than fulfillment.
Yeah, no, there's sort of like a surplus kind of.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you. Absolutely.
There's something which is absolutely unbearable. You have had the experience, and I have the experience where I thought that my life could end after a movie.
Absolutely.
Never after an orgasm, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But after a movie, yes.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's also part of the reason why people are so into film, that it really has this kind of libidinal thing. But it's interesting, you say about, I can't remember, that it's pointing to something you desire that you didn't even know. I mean, obviously that's like Zizek's point with the pervert's guide, that film is the pervert art that tells you, you didn't know you desired this, but here it is. But, I think that's absolutely right. And that's a whole other dimension to go into, that there's this excess in film that's, great.
Hello. Can you elaborate on your idea about alienation from alienation that you had it? Because, you went through so many topics that it wasn't properly defined. So
that's true. I always want to get to the end of this quick.
I have a little under question. Because how can someone alienate from something, since alienation is an indeterminate character of thinking that creates abstract relation to the thing that we are alienate from?
You might have to repeat that last bit or text it to me.
Okay. So how can you alienate from something? Since alienation is undeterminate character of thinking that creates abstract relation to the thing that we are alienated from. So how do you create an alienation from alienation?
Well, this is the thing. I think that this idea of lack resists and is very productive. And as Laurent was pointing out with maybe the way that film is there's so much libidinal investment in film that this is because of lack, right? So there's a resistance there. But I think that the alienation from it, maybe it's not successful, and it's to do, that when we repress, maybe the right word is like repress or whatever, but when we repress it, it returns, it always comes back in some way. The contradiction is always there, and the contradiction at the level of subjectivity is this primary alienation, maybe. But yeah, I don't think it's like a successful alienation, but there is this turn away from contradiction, lack.
But how
Yeah.
do you define the alienation?
How do I define it? Well, I mean, it would take quite a long time, right? But yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
just the final question.
Is there?
We don't
Okay.
have time.
Okay. I guess I want to put in a word for psychoanalytic film theory. First of all, I mean, you know, I think that the work of Christian Metz and Kaja Silverman and some of these people is pretty good, and that it maybe is doing things on a level that you would appreciate in terms of your own argument vis-a-vis the sort of formalism of film and its relationship to the operation of the unconscious, not really in the level of narrative and character and a kind of vulgar Freudianism. But I guess so then along with that, coming back to Mulvey, I mean, what strikes me about this question of the universality of lack is that I don't think actually Lacan would agree.
Okay.
I think that in Lacan, actually, what is scandalous about Lacan's position is that, on the contrary, the relationship between desire and lack is always structured according to sex. Mm-hmm. That is to say, it actually has to be either male or female. So
sexuation,
the graphs of sexuation, precisely what they mean, and what is so scandalous about the binarism of Lacanianism in this respect, is that there is no universal lack that we all share. Mm-hmm. Actually, one will relate to it either as a man or a woman. That's what people don't like in Lacan. And the thing about that, so coming back to Mulvey then, is that what I think is interesting is that, okay, take or leave the sort of empirical political situation that she's responding to, the context of her second wave feminism, I think actually the kind of power of that essay is the idea that a film constructs a subject position that the viewer must occupy, that the viewer will be put in the position of. It's not just about the content of the film or the fact that there's some misogynist director. The film constructs a subject position from which it is viewed, and it has to be either male or female. And it could be a woman who makes a film that constructs the position of the male gaze. It could be a man who makes a film that constructs the position of the female gaze.
Yeah.
But that determination that it has to be occupied by one of these two, that I think is a kind of Lacanian perspective on the question.
This is true, and I guess where I would differ maybe is that the point you make that the man can be a woman and a woman can be a man. And that's the political, that's where the queer theory is political. But the woman is a woman and the man is a man is the where it goes wrong.
Yeah, I think if we just step back one level from the empirical situation of second wave feminism and say, nevertheless, there's something in that essay which is important. It relates to gender as a structure and a framing of the, well, that's the idea of the gaze, I think.
I think it sort of says that gender is essence. But I could read it differently. But yeah.
Well, Helen, what men's got to do, and my task is to end this brilliant talk and discussion. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.